Welcome to another video lesson from the Highland Church of Christ. The purpose of this lesson series is going to be to study the life of Jesus. Now, to study the life of Jesus, you're going to want to look at the first 4 books of the New Testament of the Bible. That is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, often referred to as the Gospels. Now, I will admit that each of these 4 Gospels, if you look at them side by side, you're going to recognize that there are differences between the 4 books. And this is because they were written by 4 different authors. They were written to 4 different audiences for 4 different purposes. But we're going to note that there aren't contradictions between the 4 accounts, but actually that we can line them up, we can connect the dots, and we can look at Jesus' life across all 4 of them, and we're going to attempt to do this in a chronological way. As we look at this chronological study of the life of Jesus, I'd actually like to begin just before the life of Jesus. In this first part of our series, we're going to look at the genealogy of Jesus. And as I said, there are slight differences between what's recorded in the different Gospels. And so for the genealogy of Jesus, you're going to find that it's only recorded in Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 3. We're going to look at both of these passages as we consider the importance of the genealogy of Jesus. As we go through this lesson series, I'm hoping to be able to ask questions that you might be able to discuss with others who are there gathered with you, or that you might be able to ponder for yourself, write down some answers, write down some thoughts as we're going through, and so I may ask a question and then give you a moment to consider your answer. And so the first question as we're looking at this is I want you to consider, are genealogies important? Are genealogies important? You see, as you read through the Bible, you're going to recognize that there are different points where it begins to describe someone's family line. And it will say, and so begot so-and-so, which means they had them as a son, they had them as a daughter. Usually it's recording just the male names, but it would say so-and-so begot so-and-so, and he begot so-and-so, and he lived a certain amount of years, and then he begot so-and-so, and it continues this way. If you've ever taken on the challenge to read the Bible in a year, or to read the Bible in a certain amount of time, eventually you come to these passages, the genealogies, the records of people's children, of their lineage. And when you get to this point, some people can think it's a little dry. The names are difficult to pronounce. It can run together. It can become confusing. And so I understand that some people almost want to skip those sections of the Scripture. But I want you to consider for a moment, are genealogies important? Now that I've given you time to ponder that question, are genealogies important? I'd like to turn your attention to 2 passages in the New Testament. Both of these passages were written by Paul. One of them will be in 1 Timothy, and one of them will be in the book of Titus. And Paul writes to these young men, giving them advice in their various ministries, telling them how to interact with others. And there's 2 passages here where he's going to mention genealogies. The first is in 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. Here's what Paul wrote. He said, "As I urged you when I went into Macedonia, remain in Ephesus, that you may charge some that they teach no other doctrine, nor give heed to fables and endless genealogies, which cause disputes, rather than godly edification, which is in faith." And so here in 1 Timothy chapter 1, Paul seems to be warning Timothy that endless genealogies can cause these disputes and that they would be unprofitable. He's telling him to avoid these discussions of endless genealogies. So as we're considering, are genealogies important, we're seeing in Scripture a passage warning about conversations, warning about disputes or arguments that might arise due to genealogies. Keep that in mind as we read another passage from Titus chapter 3. Titus chapter 3. This is just a couple pages further, just a couple chapters further. Titus chapter 3, and now verse 8. Paul writes to this man, he says, "This is a faithful saying, and these things I want you to affirm constantly, that those who believe in God should be careful to maintain good works. These things are good and profitable to men." So he's given him a lot of advice about how to behave, about how to interact with different types of people in Titus chapter 3. And he's saying these things are profitable, these things are useful. Verse 9 now. "But avoid foolish disputes, genealogies, contentions, and strivings about the law, for they are unprofitable and useless. Again, we have a passage mentioning genealogies, and again it mentions them as being useless or unprofitable. And so I ask the question again, are genealogies important? Now, I believe Paul has a purpose behind this warning that he writes to these two young men. That there is a danger if you get caught up in these conversations of endless genealogies. But I believe the danger that he's writing about is specifically dealing with some Jewish traditions. See, the Jews were very concerned with these genealogies for a couple of different reasons. Number one, I'd like to point out that the Pharisees liked to keep track of their genealogies, of their lineages, to prove that they came from a line of Pharisees. It would make them feel superior to others. Now, Paul himself made a statement in Acts chapter 23, and it shows that someone had been keeping track of his line, that he came from a line of Pharisees before he had been converted. And so we see that that could be the reason that there were some people who were still concerned with keeping track of their family line to prove that they came from these great Pharisees. Another reason is that the Jews were keeping track of these genealogies because they were expecting the Messiah to come through a specific lineage. And so for that reason, they're keeping track of these genealogies, they're keeping track of everyone's family lineage so that they can see and they can prove that the Messiah had come through the true line. And so I think Paul is writing because he's having to deal with Jews, or because Timothy and Titus are having to deal with these Jews who were stuck on these genealogies for these reasons. But the problem is, at the time of him writing these letters, Jesus had already come. The Messiah had already come. And so these conversations that he's having with these Jews, if that's the reasoning behind it, these are Jews who don't recognize Jesus as the Messiah who had come. And so this is the difficulty with those conversations. So there is this warning about how some genealogies are not important. Some genealogies can lead to an argument, they can lead to a dispute, they can be harmful. How do we tell what genealogies are important? I think the best way to tell which genealogies are important is that we only focus on these that are recorded within the Scripture. I believe in passages such as 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16 and 17, that say all Scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, for reproof, for correction, for instruction in righteousness, that the man of God may be complete, thoroughly equipped for every good work. There is a purpose for every Scripture contained within the Bible. There is a purpose, and it can be profitable. And so when we come to those passages where it has the genealogy, where it can be difficult for us to get through that text, where it can seem repetitive, where the names can be confusing, there is still profit, there is still value there, according to 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 16 and 17. And so the genealogies recorded in Scripture are important. And the genealogies recorded in Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 3, dealing with Jesus specifically, are recorded there to prove that Jesus came through the appropriate line. Now you can look at various prophecies from the Old Testament. Promises that were made, prophecies that are recorded, that show that the Messiah, the coming King, was going to have to come through a particular line. Number one, according to Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, a promise was made to Abraham that this coming Messiah would be from the line of Abraham. So that would have to be included. You can also look at a passage in Genesis chapter 49 and verse 10 that says the scepter would not depart from Judah. The scepter being something held by the king, it's saying that this coming king, the coming Messiah, would come from the tribe of Judah. You can also look at passages such as Isaiah chapter 9, where it suggests that the line would also have to come through David. That this ancestor of David would be that Messiah. Peter made a similar point in Acts chapter 2. In fact, let's look there in Acts chapter 2, as he's preaching on the day of Pentecost, where he makes a point about David and this coming Messiah, this coming king. In Acts chapter 2, verse 25, Peter is speaking, and he says, David says concerning him, I foresaw the Lord always before my face, for he is at my right hand, that I may not be shaken. Therefore my heart rejoiced, and my tongue was glad. Moreover, my flesh also will rest in hope, for you will not leave my soul in Hades, nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption. You have made known to me the ways of life. You will make me full of joy in your presence. Peter then said, verse 29, "Men and brethren, let me speak freely to you of the patriarch David, that he is both dead and buried, and his tomb is with us to this day." So if David was dead and buried, they knew where his tomb was, then who was he talking about? Peter continues, verse 30, he says, "Therefore, being a prophet, and knowing that God had sworn with an oath to him that of the fruit of his body, according to the flesh, he would raise up the Christ to sit on his throne." The coming Messiah was going to come through the line of Abraham. The coming Messiah was going to come from the tribe of Judah, and the coming Messiah was going to come through the line of David. If you look in Matthew chapter 1 and in Luke chapter 3, you will see by those genealogies that these things are true. Look with me now at Matthew chapter 1, beginning with verse 1. Matthew chapter 1, verse 1 begins by saying, "The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham." Now, Jesus is not biologically the son of David or the son of Abraham, but it begins the Gospel of Matthew by making this bold claim that they're going to prove by their Gospel account that Jesus comes from the line of David and the line of Abraham, which is suggesting that he is the Christ. From verse 1, he is suggested to be Jesus the Christ, the Messiah they had been looking for because of this genealogy. Look here at verse 2. "Abraham begot Isaac. Isaac begot Jacob, and Jacob begot Judah and his brothers. Judah begot Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Perez begot Hezron, and Hezron begot Ram. Ram begot Amminadab, Amminadab begot Nahshon, and Nahshon begot Salmon. And Salmon begot Boaz by Rahab, Boaz begot Obed by Ruth, Obed begot Jesse, and Jesse begot David the king." You can see just shortly into the Gospel of Matthew that Jesus comes from this line. It mentions Abraham, it mentions Isaac, Jacob, Judah, and then it comes through to David. He had to come through the line of David, and it says David the king. Jesus comes through the appropriate line, and you can continue reading from there. You'll come all the way down to verse 17. See, I don't know how far back you can trace your family history, but here recorded in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus' family history, his genealogy, goes back to Abraham. If you look here at verse 17 of Matthew chapter 1, it says, "So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations. From David until captivity in Babylon are 14 generations. And from captivity in Babylon until the Christ are 14 generations." That's 42 generations in all in the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus' family line provides a lot of evidence that he is the Messiah. Now, as we continue through the study, we're going to see several other prophecies that come true, several other things that lend evidence. But already we see this overwhelming evidence from the genealogy of Jesus that he comes from the appropriate line. That this Jesus could be the Christ, that this Jesus could be that long-awaited Messiah. We're also going to look in Luke chapter 3, and again, we're going to note some differences between the two gospel accounts. Luke chapter 3 this time. Beginning with verse 23, we have recorded the genealogy of Jesus. But notice the difference here. It says in verse 23, "Now Jesus himself began his ministry at about 30 years of age, being as was supposed the son of Joseph, the son of Heli, the son of Matthat." It continues from there, but we're noticing a difference already in that when Luke records the genealogy of Jesus, he begins with Jesus and works backwards. Whereas in Matthew, he started with Abraham and worked toward Jesus, and he gave us 42 generations of Jesus' family. In Luke, he records it slightly different, but he still gives us all of the necessary people. You can look here in verse 31. It says, "The son of Meliah, the son of Menan, the son of Mattana, the son of Nathan, the son of David." There we have through the line of David. That was one that he was required to come through. Look also at verse 34. It says, "The son of Jacob, the son of Isaac, the son of Abraham." Both in the Gospel of Matthew and in the Gospel of Luke, we see the required line. That Jesus comes through those required individuals and the required tribe of Judah. In both accounts that's recorded. Now there are some slight differences. And some people question, why is this genealogy different from the one in Matthew? And you see, it's providing more and more evidence the deeper you go into the text. What seems to be happening here, and as I had mentioned briefly earlier, is that usually just the father is mentioned in the genealogy. In Matthew, you'll notice that there are some women's names. But here in Luke, it just mentions the fathers. But more likely than not, in Luke, this is not the genealogy of Jesus through Joseph, but this is the genealogy of Jesus through Mary. Which means if Jesus has two parents, his mother and his father, and granted his father did not necessarily contribute biologically, but through both of his parents, Mary and Joseph, Jesus has the correct genealogy. Both lines come through Abraham. Both lines come from Judah. Both lines come through David. Jesus is able to be this awaited Messiah. Jesus is able to be that Christ. These are just the first dots that we're connecting of many. But also in Luke chapter 3, as if that wasn't enough evidence, more is recorded of the genealogy of Jesus. See, in Matthew, it recorded the genealogy from Jesus to Abraham. But here in Luke chapter 3, it continues back even further than that. Look at verse 38 to see how far it goes. It says, the son of Enosh, the son of Seth, the son of Adam, the son of God. Jesus' genealogy through his mother Mary is recorded in the Gospel of Luke, Luke chapter 3, all the way back to Adam. There is so much evidence here. There is so much recorded. There is so much detail given. And it is important. We're seeing that Jesus has the appropriate lineage. We're seeing the beginning of these prophecies being fulfilled through him. And we're just going to see more and more as we continue through this study. I appreciate you listening to this. I know that this is shorter than our typical Bible class sessions, but here's what I would encourage you from this point. I would challenge you to read these genealogies yourself. Sometimes it can be difficult to get through the names. Sometimes it can be a little bit dry, some would say. But I hope you're recognizing that there are important details here, that there are exciting things within the genealogy of Jesus. As you go through the genealogy, I would encourage you to look for names that you recognize. There are some things that you may be surprised by, some things that you may have forgotten since the last time that you read these passages. In Matthew chapter 1, I would encourage you to look for the 5 women who are listed in the genealogy. This is somewhat of a rare occurrence that a woman would be listed in the genealogy, but Matthew records 5 different women. See if you can find all 5. Another thing that's interesting is you look at the gospel account of Luke. He records the genealogy of Jesus all the way back to Adam and then saying God as the creator. You can also notice there from which of Noah's 3 sons the lineage of Jesus comes. There are interesting details in the text. I love the way it connects. I hope that you will dig deeper into this study. And please let me know if you have any questions, any more guidance that I can give you as you go through this study. This is just the first part of our study of the life of Jesus, that we're recognizing even from the very beginning, even from before addressing his birth, he comes through the correct lineage. And we have this evidence because we have this genealogy recorded in Scripture. It is important. It is valuable. It is profitable, just as we read in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 16 and 17. I hope that you value it. I hope that you grow from this experience, and I hope to see you in the next video.